everybody, it's Drybear. Path of Exile 2.3 is coming in just under 24 hours at this point, tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern, Friday, so depending on where you are in the world. Pretty awesome, like the patch is massive, and so the patch notes is so big and they keep adding to it. What I decided to do is split out the changes here, and since the launch is tomorrow, what I'll probably do is use actual footage from the patch going live with a real skill tree that we can look at to go through all the changes, because I think there's still a lot of people, at least in my community and people that I see online, that they're so like, they look at the patch notes and they're just, their mind like melts out of their ears, because it's literally like it's a full like novel that you're having to read. So yesterday what I did is I did a overview of the general game-wide changes to know about. We've already gone over the high-level content changes in a video, but today I want to start getting into the individual classes, and today we're going to start with the Sorceress, which I think is a great place to start, because in this patch, from a game-wide perspective, they are reworking how elemental exposure works, as well as adding elemental infusions and changing how element gets applied. So all of those things together works great for elemental characters. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be a sorceress, but there's also a ton of reworks for sorceress skills that completely change how they function, which you add that to the elemental exposure changes, the addition of the elemental infusions, and as well as all of the elemental reworks as well. All that comes together to make a completely different sorceress. And while it may not be, you know, people are looking at Deadeye and stuff right now, I want to talk today about what sorceress changes are coming for the class specifically. But before we dive in, there are new Twitch drops available with the launch of .3. The Clam Stash, which changes your stash, and the Helmet of the Abyssal are free. All you have to do is watch a Twitch stream. I will be streaming a lot of the .3, so if you want to head over to twitch.tv/Drybear, you'll be able to get this sweet helmet and the Clam Stash just by having the stream open. You don't even have to watch or listen, just have the stream open. You'll get the drops as part of your account, which is pretty cool, as well as the Cape of the Abyssal, so themed with it. All these are drops that you'll get on top of it. They also will be running another Support a Streamer campaign. So if you're looking for that, this cool Valico portal, which looks wicked, it's got some crazy like Ori / like Ghibli vibes coming from it as well. All you have to do is gift 2 Twitch subscriptions to a streamer that is currently in the category. You don't have to give it to me, but I would appreciate it if you decide to do that in the first place. So just find a streamer. I'll be live playing Path of Exile 2. Find a streamer on Twitch that has this going on, and then gift them 2 subscriptions. They have to be gifted, not primes. And then once you do that, you'll get the portal as well as the drops as well. Thank you for the support if you decide to do so, or if you want to send it to your favorite streamer. If that's not me, you can do that too. Now, if you aren't aware or you missed my video yesterday, I'm going to quickly recap this. They are adding in, they're combining all of the elemental exposures into one buff or debuff. So previously you had cold exposure, lightning exposure, and fire exposure, a way to lower a resistance or damage reduction to elemental damage of a specific type. However, this created builds where you had to specify one element, and it was kind of awkward to do multi-element, and they wanted people to do multi-element. So with the patch going live in .3, they're combining all of the elemental exposures into one, just called elemental exposure. So it applies all 3 elements simultaneously, which means you're more encouraged to use multiple elements on top of that as well. They're also buffing up the elemental ailments as well. So Shock's duration got doubled, Chill's duration got doubled, and they reworked the way Ignite works. Now Ignite has a pity system built into it, where every time you fail to ignite, the flammability on the target goes up, getting to a point where it will guarantee your ignite as you're doing it. So you're able to do that. And this isn't Sorceress gameplay. I'm just going to use new gameplay from the patch. Additionally, they're adding in elemental infusions. There will be items and some gems and some various ways to spawn these, but what they will be is when you trigger an elemental infusion, it will drop an orb on the ground that you can walk over and pick up, which grants you a temporary buff that you can then consume to add that element to attacks and spells after the fact. So again, it's not, it's not one way to do it. There's going to be various spells like Storm Orb and stuff like that that can spawn elemental infusions, but you can get a fire infusion and then make your next spell gain fire on top of it, which is super cool and makes Sorceress in particular quite interesting. Now, you can get one element type of the 3 for each infusion. You get a fire infusion, a lightning infusion, and a cold infusion. But I made a quick list of all the different interactions that Sorceress specifically specifically will have with Sorceress specific abilities that interact with infusions, which all of this makes it really interesting. So there's also a lot of these abilities have been reworked or buffed or changed in some ways, and we'll go over that in a minute. But I kind of wanted to kind of express the possibilities for the infusion system, especially with a primary elemental character like the Sorceress base class. For Incinerate, which is your flamethrower ability, which has completely reworked, we'll talk about it in a second. If you have a fire infusion, when you do Incinerate, it will also create an ignited ground on the ground. And there are easy ways to get fire infusions to spawn regularly. Ice Nova can consume cold infusions to do more damage and create a chilled area, so another area that you can spawn. Firestorm is wacky. So Firestorm can actually accept and consume all 3 element types to change what the Firestorm does. For the most part, it'll consume all of them at once. So you can have, all 3 elements in a single Firestorm, or you can have, fire plus an additional one on top of it. Most of them just they spawn projectiles that come out that is that element. So you can actually get a Firestorm that'll have cold, fire, and lightning spewing out of it, spewing fire, shooting projectiles, lightning and cold all over the place. It's nuts. And then for some of these, there might be some bonus damage involved as well, but just kind of think of it as, at a high level, Firestorm can consume elemental infusions to spawn additional projectiles from the Firestorm that aren't even of that original element type, which is cool. Fireball, the projectile, which has seen some pretty major reworks, can consume fire infusions to spawn secondary projectiles. So not just the primary projectile of your Fireball, but also additional projectiles if you currently have a fire infusion buff active. Ember Fusillade, the one where you build up projectiles and fire them all at once, it can consume lightning infusions to add an additional chain lightning hit when the Fusillade projectile hits the target. And keep in mind, because this is a channeling skill where you build up Fusillade projectiles, it will consume lightning infusion for all projectiles when you let go. When you fire the Fusillade, it will apply it to all of them. So it's not like it'll consume one infusion and do one projectile. It's all, once you're done channeling and you have your projectiles and you release the Fusillade, every single one of those projectiles for that fire will do the fire damage, but also chain lightning when it hits targets as well, which is super crazy. Comet, the normal cold spell that drops a cold one thing on top of it, can now consume fire infusions to also deal fire damage when it lands and have an increased radius when it explodes as well. Ball Lightning can consume fire infusions to leave ignited ground on the ground, or ignited ground on the ground, an AoE. And also when Ball Lightning reaches its max distance and you have a fire infusion when you launched it, it'll explode in fire as well. Arc, your normal arc thing, can consume lightning infusion to chain to additional targets. So like it's normally a Palpatine lightning shot. It used to be targeted towards a target. Now it's a projectile, so it can benefit from projectile effects, and you can also pre-fire it without a target in mind, which is super cool. And if you have a lightning infusion, you can make it double lightning for double the shock to be able to do extra lightning damage on that as well. And then Spark can also consume cold infusions to fire a large number of ice sparks on top of the lightning sparks that are already there. So this is just a short list of all the cool interactions you can now get with Sorceress by spawning infusions and collecting them. Again, there are various ways to get these infusions, gems, talent tree options, potentially even uniques and stuff like that. So you will find various ways to spawn and collect these infusions, but I think Sorceress uniquely, and Invoker for Monk as well, have a cool perspective where they have the ability to use lots of elements in combination to be the elemental avatar. Next, let's dive into the skill changes, because a lot of these are quite substantial and will change how you view Sorceress in a large way. And a lot of them are pretty exciting, in my opinion, on how they can rework things that previously were either close to being relevant or meta, but just weren't all the way there, to some things that were just pretty weak overall and were really hard to use. So starting with Arc, we mentioned this briefly a second ago, but Arc is no longer you aim at a target and it locks onto the target and chains to that target immediately. It is now a projectile, which again means that you can have projectile effects onto it. You can split the projectiles, you can speed up or slow down the projectiles, you get all your projectile scaling as well, and you can also pre-fire, which means you can start sending out arcs without a target in mind, which is useful with the projectile perspective. So here, now it's a projectile. It no longer causes explosions against shocked enemies and is no longer a payoff skill, which means it's not consuming any effects as well. However, it now chains 6 to 9 times, and instead of causing explosions on shocked enemies, it instead will now cause a higher shock magnitude. I think this makes a very good, one button, like a single skill kind of thing. Because if personally for me, I think being able to trigger effects on shocked enemies should be more of a specific skill. And I think a lot of people wanted Arc to be more of a damage dealing skill rather than a buffing, debuffing synergy type skill. And so by removing the explosion from the shocked enemies, but adding in increased shock magnitude, again, if you don't know or if you forgot because it's been a while, shock is basically a damage amplifier. What it does by default is when a target is shocked, obviously there's trigger effects that can come from that, but it just makes the target take more damage. So when you increase the magnitude of the shock, you're increasing the magnitude of the damage amp on the target, which just gives you more damage overall. It also, as I mentioned, can consume Lightning Infusion to chain additional times and for additional damage when it does chain. And the base damage has been increased at all levels. So Arc, by default, is now doing more damage, chaining more times, is now a projectile, and has the ability to get additional chains and additional damage if you currently are lightning infused. Next for Ball Lightning, we talked about this briefly. Consumes a fire infusion to leave ignited ground on the ground, and when it gets to the end of its flight, it will explode. So, keep in mind that across the board, the stat requirements are coming down on all gems and equipment. Additionally, a lot of the gems have had their end game damage scaled up. So up to the, up closer to 20 quality. And then if you go above 20 quality up to 30, the end game damage values of these is going up. And so Ball Lightning is likely in that category, but now you can consume fire infusions with it. Next up is Cold Snap. So the way Cold Snap used to work is you would be able to use it on a frozen enemy to cause it to explode, or you could cast it on a Frostbolt in flight and cause the Frostbolt to explode. So it was kind of like this way to deal with cold. However, again, in their crusade to make multi-element a viable option in Path of Exile 2, they have renamed it to simply Snap, and now it can be used on not just frozen enemies, but also shocked or ignited enemies, and can still be used on Frostbolts as well. So if an enemy has any elemental status ailment on them at all, or there's a Frostbolt in flight, you can snap, causing it to explode. It also, when you snap an elemental ailment or a Frostbolt, it creates a remnant of the corresponding type. So a cold infusion, fire infusion, the lightning infusion, that sort of thing, and can chain react to a limited extent, which means that an explosion of snap might be able to, if you put it on one shocked target, it might explode and cause other shocked targets in the areas to explode as well. So they put a little bit of logic in there to be able to allow that to ripple a little bit. It's not going to blow the whole screen up like the old Herald device, Herald of Thunder interaction, but it will give you a little bit more leeway in a group that has elemental ailments on them. Additionally, the damage has been increased. So for these, when I talk about damage increase, I'm just going to talk about the top end. I'm not going to talk about the ranges changing because I think it's more confusing. I think that people understand a little bit easier when I talk about the highest possible damage of the skill went up or down, and this is the new highest possible damage at the maximum quality. I think that's easier to understand for most people, in my opinion. So the top end before was 810 base damage. The top end for Cold Snap will now be 1005. So a good increase for that as well. It's like 20-something% increased up, which is really good. And they also made it so the cold explosion version, when you use Cold Snap, or now called Snap, the cold explosion that comes from it will now do 50% more damage to unique enemies. They had a goal with this patch to make it so, freezing, tough enemies is more rewarding, and you also get more damage from shatters and things like that. Next with Comet, they also, there were some cast on the tricks with Comet. They were very powerful. It wasn't that the entire power of your build was coming from Comet, and I can definitely see why they wanted to increase the Comet here. But for Comet, the base damage has gone up. So the highest base damage before was 1062. It's now going up to 1243. So again, a pretty substantial increase in the base damage for this as well. And again, as we mentioned, it can be fire infused, giving you fire damage when the cold meteor lands and increasing the radius of the impact. Ember Fusillade, as we mentioned, can be infused with with lightning, causing all of the hits to chain lightning, and it counts for the entire cast. As I mentioned here, 1 infusion equals all embers for that. This one's kind of a fun one. It's technically not consuming a infusion, but they added new functionality to Eye of Winter, which is your frozen orb spiritual successor. When passing through Flame Wall, the eye and all shards that the Eye of Winter shoots gain the flame wall's bonus fire damage. So even without infusions, you have a new interaction where you can put a flame wall on the ground, shoot Eye of Winter through it, and it'll gain bonus fire damage based on the flame wall's damage on all of the small projectiles and the large projectile as well. Fireball has been reworked. It no longer creates the secondary projectiles by default. You now have to infuse it to get that effect. So now it consumes a fire infusion to launch the secondary projectiles. So if you were kind of relying on that functionality before, it is now part of the infusion system now. However, projectiles and explosions, the damage is increased from 202 at the top end to 362 at the top end. So damage going up almost double, like quite substantial, a good 70-something% there for that. The secondary projectiles that come from the fire infusion as well has had their damage increased. Now, keep in mind, this is going from the top end of 218 to the top end of 606. So almost triple the damage on the secondary projectiles. And they also made it so the secondary projectiles can hit the same target as the primary. So when you shoot a fire-infused fireball, it's going to hit the target with the primary projectile, spawn the secondary projectiles, and those secondary projectiles can also hit the same target again, which gives you crazy damage. So combine that with the fact that the explosion and the primary projectile have had their damage substantially increased at base, and the secondary projectiles damage has been almost tripled. Though keep in mind, remember, it's not doing the secondary projectiles with every fire of the spell anymore. It's going to be a little less frequent because you have to pick up a fire infusion first. So this damage is a little misleading, but it is quite nice, especially given the fact that it can now hit the primary target that the primary projectile hit in addition. Moving on to Firestorm, this absolutely outrageous system that they've got going on here. This thing is just a crazy experience. So they're adding a bunch of functionality with it. It no longer is going to consume Ignite when it hits, and it has the ability to consume all 3 elemental infusion types, doing different things. So if you consume a fire infusion, it causes the storm to double in size and give 3 times the bolt count. So fire infusion on Firestorm just makes it go absolutely bonanzas. Cold and lightning specifically will each give additional cold or additional lightning bolts that come out of the Firestorm, and one of each infusion can be consumed by a single use, which means that if you currently have a fire infusion, a lightning infusion, and a cold infusion floating around you, and you cast Firestorm, it's going to double in size, give 3 times the amount of fire projectiles, also spawn cold projectiles, and also spawn lightning projectiles all at once. Nuts. On top of that, the bolts that are fire that come out have had their base damage increased from 83 per bolt at top end to 144, so a nice substantial increase there. And I skipped over the first 2 lines on purpose because we wanted to look at this doubling in size right here. But by default, Firestorm is getting its radius cut in half essentially. So it's going from 5.6 meters to 2.8 meters, so the radius is quite a bit smaller. And additionally, the amount of bolts that it creates is being slowed to half the rate as well. So it used to spawn a bolt every 0.1 seconds. Now it's going to spawn a bolt every 0.2 seconds instead. And that's because you can spawn additional bolts using the infusion system. So the radius is getting smaller, but if you use a fire infusion, it doubles back to its original size, triples its bolt count, which helps with this here. And you can also add additional elemental bolts of cold and lightning. So a pretty crazy rework for Firestorm that makes it quite interesting in my opinion. Next up is Frost Bomb, and this one is a little bit odd. I think they're trying to make it more utility than damage. Frost Bomb is actually a very good leveling skill. It falls off a little bit towards the end, but you can see with the changes they're making here, they're kind of making it more of a on cooldown, used for a purpose kind of thing, rather than spamming for damage in that way. So Frost Bomb is now going to have its base damage reduced from 701 at top end to 538. So base damage coming down. The cooldown is also increasing from 3.5 seconds to 6 seconds, almost double the cooldown for the duration there. And the detonation time has increased as well from 3 seconds to detonate at base. Obviously, this is a modifiable stat, so you can make it faster if you want to with support gems and other effects. But the detonation time at base is going from 3 seconds to 4 seconds. So that is getting slower with a longer cooldown and less damage. However, now it chills enemies as though dealing more damage, so more freeze buildup, which is, again, a utility aspect. It now also applies elemental exposure. So we're losing damage, longer cooldown, detonation time is getting slower. However, it now will apply a global debuff that lowers resistance to elemental damage for all damage types and applies more freeze buildup than before, but it has a limit of 1. So it's no longer really spammable, and it's going to be a lot less powerful as a damage dealer, but it gets a nice utility aspect to it as well. So it's important to keep this in mind. Next, they made a game-wide change on pretty much all ice splinters or ice walls that they will now deal 80% less damage 0.5 seconds after they spawn. So they're kind of getting you to spawn them and not instantly detonate them. It sounds like they're trying to force you to spawn 2 or 3 of them before you detonate them, rather than one detonate, one detonate, one detonate. Because if you end up detonating the ice splinters, the ice clusters, or the ice walls too fast, you will get a very hefty damage reduction on that as well. So they want you to wait half a second before detonating, which means that you're better off just making multiples of them and then detonating them in a cluster. Frostbolt, which is kind of related to our cold snap changes that we just talked about, they are making it a little bit easier to cast snap on. So, it's kind of a hit or miss. Like if you wanted to use Frostbolt as a damage dealing option, this is going to be kind of a shame, but again, kind of like we saw with Frostbomb, it's like they're trying to make it a more utility than pure throughput. So the projectile speed has been reduced by 20%. Again, this makes it easier to cast snap on it. Some people had issue where the traveling Frostbolt was going so fast, especially on console, that it's hard to put your reticle or your cursor over the traveling Frostbolt and snap it to make it explode. So they're making the projectile speed slower at base. Obviously, you can speed this up if you want to, but I think this is primarily just to make it so it's easier to snap in general. It no longer leaves chilled ground as it travels by default, and it now has increased chill or increased freeze buildup as if it were dealing more damage. So just gives you more ailment from that as well. But unfortunately, with the projectile speed slowing down, the loss of the chilled ground, the projectile damage is reduced by 302 at top end to 216 at top end. So again, they're trying to make it a little bit more of a utility aspect rather than a pure damage throughput. Next up, we have Incinerate. I actually made an Incinerate leveling build last season as well. And it's just so hard to compare to the other options, like just Spark in general or Lightning Spear or whatever. And it just has its problems because it's very mana hungry in general, which the game was already pretty mana hungry overall, but it also had the problem of channeling for a long period of time, trying to get the charges up, and the damage you got wasn't really super useful. So they've done a crazy, like just top to bottom, relook at what Incinerate does, and it has been pretty much completely reworked. So what does Incinerate do now? Now it no longer has a mana cost. So when you're using your channeled flamethrower Incinerate, it no longer has a mana cost. It doesn't cost you any mana. It now has its own built-in resource. It now requires fuel, a new unique resource, gained by spending mana to use. And the way they described this in the patch notes, it sounded like it was just spend any mana. I don't know if you need to spend it on Incinerate in general. You might have to once the patch goes live and we see it for real, but it's now going to have its own resource, which I think is an improvement. It now no longer applies fire exposure. So they're trying to move this away from utility and into being a damage throughput option. The cast speed is now fixed, so you don't have to run a bunch of cast speed to get it to tick up faster and faster and faster. They're going to make it a fixed cast speed so that you can just focus on scaling the damage and building up fuel rather than trying to make it as fast as possible. So you're just kind of doing a crazy flamethrower. Now it is a fixed gain. It gains stages. As it moves up in stages, the flame gets bigger and gets more powerful. Now it gains a stage every quarter second. So every second it's 4 stages going up. The cone length has been increased from 4.6 meters to 5.8 meters. So the length of the flamethrower got longer, and the max stages went up as well, which means not only can you get more damage at the top end, right? It went from 8 stages total to 12. You now have 4 more stages, and each stage adds damage to it as well, so you get more value out of that on top of it. It no longer creates burning ground by default, but if you consume a fire infusion, you can create that ignited ground, and the ignited ground area has increased from 0.8 meters to 1.4, so it got almost twice as big, and the ignite value, the flammability value, is much higher than it was before. So it now ignites as though dealing, instead of 470 damage, it ignites as though dealing 778. If you're wondering what that means, it just means that that's the magnitude scalar for how it applies the elemental status effect. So if it does more damage, it should apply more ignite, or in this case, more flammability. So it now has a higher flammability into ignite ratio. It now has a bigger cone length, more stages for more damage, and it doesn't require mana anymore. So this should be a pretty cool change for Incinerate, and hopefully this means we can make some really cool late game flamethrower builds. Next up is Lightning Conduit. It no longer consumes shock on targets hit. I think they're trying to be a little bit more careful about where they do payoff skills that consume effects and how those work. You'll see a little bit of that when we look at Armor Break for the warrior class specifically, but mercenary as well. Anyone can do it, but those are the primaries. It now has a 6-second cooldown, but to counteract this cooldown, they have increased the base damage from 297 at the max at the top end to 568. So a pretty sizable base damage increase. And now has 2 additional bolts if a shocked enemy is in the area. So it fires additional bolts if the target is shocked, no longer consumes the shock on the target, so you can keep the damage amp on it. And it has higher damage, but has a cooldown. So they're trying to get you to use this, not spamming it, but being able to get more, you use it occasionally as part of your rotation to get value out of it. Next, Solar Orb has always been an elemental magic, or essentially a sorceress weapon, even though they don't really have a weapon that provides skills. It is a sorceress skill, Solar Orb. You put this little Shwoomba nuclear, fission orb on the ground, and it pulses fire damage. However, they decided that that was better suited for a non-class specific option. So Solar Orb is now the skill, the inherent skill that comes with the Pyrophyte Stave. And if you're a knower, you'll know that the Pyrophyte Stave used to give Living Bomb, the Kael'thas Warcraft style, option where you put the bomb on them and it explodes later. So those two skills have now swapped. Pyrophyte Stave has lost the Living Bomb as an inherent skill, and that has moved to be a tier 3 elemental skill gem from the Sorceress starting point. And Solar Orb is now the passive skill that you get on Pyrophyte. And keep in mind that across the board, all of the weapon skills for caster weapons have been increased in damage, which means Solar Orb probably has 2. But now Living Bomb is an option that you can use on your skill setup there without needing a specific staff to use it with. And along with this, now that Living Bomb is going to be one of our, gem cut options for the elemental skill tree area, Living Bomb is now going to get some other changes as well. It no longer explodes at the end of the duration. So it means that, you have other ways to trigger this as well. What are those other ways? Well, now it explodes upon dealing enough damage to the enemy, or if it times out. So basically, if you can deal enough damage to the enemy, you can cause the Living Bomb to detonate earlier, which is actually quite nice. It means that you have the option to kind of build up living bombs and then throw out a big damage option that triggers all the living bombs at once, which gives you some more AoE option potential without having to wait for the end. I think with that original duration, you would put it up and you'd wait the whole time waiting for it to go off and that sort of thing. Now you have the option to trigger it early if you do damage to the targets that have living bomb on them. Now, to coincide with this, they're increasing the duration from 2.5 seconds to 5 seconds, so doubling the duration. However, this is perfectly fine because we can detonate it early if we want to, so the extra duration isn't that big of a problem. The base crit chance on it has been reduced from 9% to 7%. If you're a Path of Exile 1 knower, you'll know that the base crit chance is a massive scalar for a lot of skills and spells in Path of Exile in general. You can make a base of 10 to 15% crit chance go to the moon based on that. So 2% on the base crit chance may not seem like that much, but it's actually quite substantial in the amount of damage it can deal from critting. But to be able to counteract this, they did a small base damage increase here. So the explosion damage when the living bomb finally goes off went from 418 at the top end to a base damage of 510. I think it's going to be a little bit easier because not only can you spam it without needing a stave, you can also spread it across more targets. And then when you want to, you can cause them all to explode at once with more room to be able to do that. However, the crit chance change is going to be noticeable, and hopefully it gets balanced out by the base damage change. Moving on to Orb of Storms, the functionality has been changed. And it's been a long day, and we can also consume lightning infusions with this as well. So now the way Orb of Storm works is it will trigger the pulses anytime you cast any spell in its radius. This one is a little confusing. The way they worded their patch notes in paragraph format was a little odd. They made it so that it fires a bolt by default every 4 seconds, plus another bolt per casted spell. So I'm guessing that these two align here, where as long as you're standing in the area of Orb of Storms and you cast any spell, you'll cause it to pulse, and it has its own default pulse, though it's quite slow. They also made it so it will create a lightning infusion if all bolts are used up or the duration expires. So if you use up all the maximum bolts, which in this case is 8, a lot easier to get to, you'll get a free lightning infusion on the ground. Or if it times out, you'll get a free lightning infusion on the ground. Either way, you'll get a lightning infusion. And again, this is how you would this is one way to create an infusion on the ground, which is pretty cool. The max bolts has been reduced from 29 to 8, most likely just to make sure that you can actually trigger the lightning infusion reliably. And they made it so, you know, it has the default firing setup, and the duration is increased from 10 to 12. Because of the fact that you can get it to trigger the lightning infusion early by sending out all the maximum bolts, the extra duration just gives you room to do that if you have to dodge attacks or move out of the area and then come back in, and then the max bolts being there. So now it's more of a option to, you know, stand inside of it, spawn lightning infusions, and also be able to do bolt damage by casting spells when you're inside of it, which kind of goes with the whole Archmage style. Solar Orb, if you remember, is now on the Pyrophyte staff as an inherent skill, but it also has been updated. It no longer has a mana cost. It's a spellcaster skill now, or spellcaster weapon skill now. And the pulse damage has been increased at base 202 to 224, and the basic ignite magnitude has increased slightly. Again, they felt like all the spellcaster weapons, like the skills that you get from spellcaster weapons, were too weak across the board, so they're all getting buffed up. And since Solar Orb is now a spellcaster weapon skill, it's no different. Then lastly, for the skill changes, if you're a Temporal Chains fan, the slow amount that you get from Temporal Chains has been increased substantially. It went up from 28% slow on the enemies to 59%, which is a crazy slow and feels kind of apropos considering there are enemies that can avoid this effect in general, so having this as an option I think is nice. Next, let's talk about the ascendancy changes, because there's some nodes here for both Chronomancer as well as Stormweaver that are getting swapped up as well. So the first one to talk about is Flood of Echoes. So we're talking about this one right here, which used to grant the Unleash skill. As you can see with the old Path of Building version that we have on here, it is just Unleash. So it is now renamed to Inevitability. It no longer grants the Unleash skill. It now grants a brand new skill for Chronomancers, Inevitable Agony. Curses all targets in an area, storing the damage that they take, and when the debuff expires from Inevitable Agony, it will take all the damage that was stored and cause it to trigger again in its entirety. So this is really crazy. I mean, this is kind of like the slow time effects that we get from like arcane mages in WoW, for example, but the time stop thing where you kind of capture all the damage in a window and then cause it to detonate when the debuff ends. Pretty cool. I think this is actually fits the Chronomancer aesthetic really well and gives us an option to double our damage essentially, right? So you curse them with Inevitable Agony, dump all your damage out, and then when Inevitable Agony ends, pop! All the damage you just did within that time window gets hit again on the target, which is pretty cool. Next, they reworked the node Quicksand Hourglass. It's kind of interesting. I wonder how the new Quicksand Hourglass is going to feel, because well, let's explain it before I get into that. So Quicksand Hourglass currently, before the patch goes live, every 10 seconds you gain 50% more cast speed for 5 seconds, which means you have about 50% uptime on a 50% cast speed buff with a downtime of the other 50% not having a buff at all, which kind of sucks, right? And also because it's always on its own running timer and there's a downtime built into it, it means that sometimes you'll get the buff when you need it, sometimes you'll get it when you're running between packs, and then when you arrive to the next pack, your cast speed is gone, and then you kill the pack, and then the buff pops up, and you're like, God dang it, I can't time this right. It gets kind of awkward. So they're reworking it so it always has a benefit of some kind. However, it's kind of bizarre. So this now grants Sands of Time with the new Quicksand Hourglass. This grants 60%, between 60% and 1% cast speed, and it will pendulum between that value. So it starts at 60, scales down to 1%, and then scales back up to 60%, and then down to 1%, and then back up. So it's constantly going in a variable amount of bonus cast speed back and forth. However, there's another pendulum effect going on simultaneously that likely will be in the opposite direction. Now it starts a 1% area of effect, so larger area on your skills and spells that scales up to 60% area over 10 seconds. So you start with 60% cast speed and 1% area of effect, and then they will meet each other in the middle and then alternate where you get to 60% area of effect and 1% cast speed, and it'll just pendulum back and forth. I think this is really neat and super interesting, but I do wonder if this is going to feel really weird. Like if your area of effect and your cast speed is constantly changing, I feel like that's going to make you miss sometimes, right? Like if you go from 60% area of effect down to 1% over a 10-second period and that constantly pendulums back and forth, are you going to put something on the ground and then it's suddenly too small to hit the enemy and then it gets bigger and then it gets, like stuff like that. I think it's super fun. I like having fun mechanics that you can play around with. I think it's certainly more interesting than the current Quicksand Hourglass, but let me know what you think. Next up is Stormweaver. So there's one of the things with Stormweaver that you have this elemental storm. It is a super fun skill, but it's kind of hard to use just because of the infrequency of using it. So they're just lowering the cooldown on it. So Tempest Caller here on the right side of the Stormweaver Ascendancy tree. This grants Elemental Storm, which is a skill that you can put in, it just puts it in your bar and it triggers Elemental Storm when you hit with crits. However, the cooldown being 5 seconds before was a bit much, especially when you're clearing screens with like Spark and stuff like that. It just felt like it wasn't proccing enough based on how you get to it. Now, keep in mind with the new skill tree that we're getting tomorrow, there's going to be a lot more options for meta skills and trigger skills specifically. So I'm hoping we can make some really cool, fun Elemental Storm builds with those new new nodes in the talent tree, and having Elemental Storm be a lower cooldown is just going to make it better and easier to utilize, especially since this is a ground deployable that spawns and ticks, meaning that you spawn it and if the enemy is already dead, that ticking rate doesn't matter. And so you basically want to have higher uptime on Elemental Storm to get value out of it, because the longer it's up, the more value you get out of it dealing damage. So having it have a shorter cooldown means you spawn it more often, means you get more damage out of it. So Elemental Storm just getting better. Now, to coincide with this change, now that we know that Elemental Storm is getting at base a shorter cooldown, that means that it kind of necessitates a relook at its follow-up node, this one down here, Rain Dancer. This gives you Elemental Storm has 150% more cooldown recovery rate, but now it has a shorter cooldown by default without even needing Rain Dancer. So Rain Dancer has been reworked. It used to give cooldown rate for Elemental Storm. Now it gives additional +1 limit for elemental skills. So this has a lot of implications. There are some skills, that we looked at before, like Frostbomb, for example. Remember when we said it was a limit of 1 Frostbomb on the ground? Having a node in the Stormweaver Ascendancy tree that allows you to get a +1 limit increase for all elemental skills of any kind, that's pretty big. And that gives us some really interesting options for what we can do for the placeables, deployables, and any of the elemental skills that have maximum limit. Another rework to the bottom left side of the tree as well. Force of Will used to give increased area or increased effect of Arcane Surge on you per 25 maximum mana. So that kind of like cast speed option for Arcane Surge. Now, instead of that, because there are other changes to the skill tree that focus on Arcane Surge, especially like some of the stuff over like over here in this area for Arcane Surge. Some of these are being changed in the update as well, so keep that in mind. So we kind of have that going on as well. Then for Force of Will, it's no longer going to affect that specifically. Now it grants 20% of damage is taken from mana before life, and a 20% increase to Arcane Surge per 10% of missing mana. So rather than a 1%, it's a little bit easier to get that. Rather than a flat mana value, it's a % missing mana, not maximum mana. So it's a little bit more, it has a theoretical limit, right? You can only go down to 0% mana and then get 10 times this value. So 100% or 200% increased Arcane Surge if you have no mana left, and gives you damage is taken from mana before life. There are some nodes over here that are more around being able to take damage from your mana instead of your life as well, but I think they're kind of trying to add a little bit more identity to what Stormweaver does relative to others. So having a defensive option here like that inside of the Stormweaver tree, while other classes may complain about it, I think it is kind of a nice option for Stormweaver in general. Now, up here in the top right, we have Scouring Winds, which is exposure you inflict lowers the affected resistance by an additional 12%. This has been renamed and reworked. So now it no longer grants that increase to exposure, but instead Pretty cool. It's renamed to Storm's Recollection, and now remnants you create, which should include infusions as well, reappear once 3 seconds after you collect them. So you'll spawn a remnant, go collect it, and then 3 seconds later, it'll pop back up again. So now with Stormweaver, we can do some cool things where we can start doubling the amount of remnants we have, which again, should also include infusions. So this is another way that once you're spawning those things, you can spawn double the amount of them because they'll reappear again. Super fun, again, kind of like the changes that we saw over here. We're going to get something that's a little bit more interesting and kind of fun, and we'll just see kind of how it plays out. But I think in general, you probably will see Stormweavers playing around with this quite a bit. Next up, a change to Heart of the Storm. Now, I think a lot of people are, they have made a global statement that they don't like people instantly generating defensive resources, like, well, I should just say energy shield. They'd still want you to life leech and mana leech and things like that. But specifically, they talked about how they don't like how energy shield builds have been so rampant, and also the fact that energy shield recharge as a stat really hasn't been getting too much love. And so they're shifting things around when it comes to energy shield, taking damage in energy shield. And they have said globally that from a conceptual standpoint, they want you to lean more in recharge for energy shield rather than generating wholesale energy shield. So keep that in mind. So this is 40% of elemental damage taken recouped as energy shield is how it works now before the patch. That is no longer the case. This has been renamed from Heart of the Storm to Refracted Infusion. And what this will do now is it has a 50% chance when collecting elemental infusion to gain another different infusion. So we just talked about being able to respawn your remnants over here on the right side. Now you'll be able to you have a 50% chance half the time when you pick up an elemental infusion, it will give you another infusion of a different kind. So say you pick up a fire infusion, you have 50% chance to get a cold or a lightning infusion in addition to the fire infusion. So keep that in mind when you think about all the different infusion conversions, especially if you're in like the Firestorm build or all these different infusions or whatever. Being able to recreate them and also generate additional ones should make this infusion, elemental exposure, elemental combination, meta for, Stormweavers or Sorceresses in general, or even, obviously like Invokers and whatever, or even people that use other elements like Lightning Spear or Galvanic Shards or whatever you want to say. But this has got kind of a cool change that I think makes it a lot more interesting. So some changes to Chronomancer, some changes to Stormweaver, quite a lot of them. Some of these nodes just getting reworked entirely. A whole bunch of infusions, elemental exposures, changes to status ailments, and the cast on effect for status ailments as well. Just makes, I think, the Sorceress build a lot more interesting and exciting compared to what it was before. So that is in my opinion, the more Sorceress specific style changes. Obviously, it's Path of Exile 2. Any class can utilize any of the skills if they want to. So it's not like these are exclusive to Sorceress, but I'm just trying to package it in a way that makes a lot more sense. So let me know what you think about these Sorceress changes, and if you are playing Sorceress to start your league tomorrow down below in the comments. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.